December 9, 1944. A military transport truck rumbled through the iron gates of Camp Stonehaven, a makeshift prisoner of war facility nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. Inside the covered cargo area, 47 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had grown thin over years of wartime deprivation. They had been captured during the Allied advance through France, serving as communications operators, administrative clerks, and medical assistants for the retreating Wehrmacht. Now they faced an uncertain future as prisoners in a country they had been taught to despise. Among them sat 23-year-old Liesel Hartmann, a former radio operator from Stuttgart, who clutched a small photograph of her mother and younger sister. She had not heard from them in 8 months. The last letter had mentioned reduced rations and the constant hunger that had become Germany's new normal. Liesel herself had grown accustomed to the hollow feeling in her stomach, the way her uniform belt needed new holes punched to keep her trousers from falling, the dizzy spells that came from standing too quickly. Hunger had become so familiar it felt like part of her identity. The truck jerked to a stop outside a long wooden building. American guards, both male and female, stood waiting with expressions that Liesel found impossible to read. She had expected hatred, perhaps cruelty. Instead, she saw something closer to curiosity mixed with what might have been pity. Captain Helen Bradshaw, a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, stepped forward as the prisoners descended from the truck. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing military, but her voice carried an unexpected gentleness when she addressed them in careful German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given shelter, medical care, and adequate food. You will work, but you will not be mistreated. Do you understand?" The women nodded silently, exchanging glances that reflected their shared skepticism. They had heard propaganda about American brutality, about prisoners worked to death or left to starve. Surely these promises were lies designed to make them compliant. But then they were led into the mess hall for their first meal, and everything Liesel thought she understood about her captivity shattered in an instant. The long tables were set with metal trays, each one holding portions of food that seemed impossible. Roasted chicken with crispy skin still glistening with fat, mashed potatoes drowning in butter, green beans, fresh bread with a soft white interior unlike the dense black bread of rationing, and on each tray, centered like a crown jewel, sat a thick slice of golden pound cake topped with a pat of butter that was slowly melting into the warm surface. Liesel stared at her tray as if it were a hallucination. Beside her, 19-year-old Clara Zimmerman began to cry silently, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. 27-year-old Sophie Brenner, who had worked as a nurse and had seen the effects of malnutrition up close, whispered in disbelief, "This cannot be real. This is one meal for all of us to share, yes?" Corporal Thomas Bennett, a young American soldier overseeing the meal service, shook his head. "No, ma'am, that's each. One tray per person, and there's more if you're still hungry after." For several long moments, none of the German women moved. They sat before their trays like people who had forgotten how to eat, their hands hovering uncertainly over utensils they seemed afraid to touch. Liesel's stomach cramped with hunger so intense it felt like pain, yet she could not bring herself to believe that this food was truly meant for her alone. It violated everything she had come to understand about the world. In Germany, a single chicken might feed a family of 6 for 2 days if stretched carefully. Butter had become a distant memory, replaced by ersatz spreads made from coal tar derivatives that tasted of chemicals and desperation. And cake, real cake, made with eggs and sugar and flour, that was something from before the war, from a time that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Captain Bradshaw had taken a seat at the end of one of the long tables, her own tray before her. She picked up her fork with deliberate slowness and began to eat, as if demonstrating that the food was safe, that this was not some elaborate trick. "Please," she said in her careful German, "you must eat. You need your strength." Slowly, tentatively, Frieda Schreiber, a 21-year-old from Hamburg who had been Liesel's bunkmate during transport, picked up her fork. Her hand trembled as she cut into the chicken, as if she expected it to vanish the moment she touched it. When the meat proved solid and real, she brought a small piece to her lips. The taste made her eyes close. A sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a moan. That single bite seemed to unlock something in the other women. Suddenly they were all eating, forks moving faster and faster as years of deprivation drove them forward with desperate urgency. Liesel attacked her meal with single-minded intensity. The chicken was so tender it fell apart under her fork. The mashed potatoes were smooth and rich, the butter creating a golden pool that she soaked up with the soft bread. She barely chewed, barely tasted, simply consumed with the frantic energy of someone who had learned never to trust that food would be available tomorrow. Around her, the other women ate with the same desperate speed. Some were crying as they ate, others made small sounds of pleasure and pain mixed together. 31-year-old Greta Vogler, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, ate so quickly she began to hiccup, but she did not slow down. And then Liesel reached the pound cake. She had saved it for last, the way a child saves the best part of a meal. The cake was golden and dense, its crumb fine and tender. The butter on top had melted completely now, creating a glossy coating that caught the light from the mess hall's hanging bulbs. She cut into it with her fork, watching how easily the utensil slid through the soft texture. The first bite was a revelation. The sweetness exploded across her tongue with an intensity that was almost painful. Real sugar, not the saccharine substitutes she had grown accustomed to. Real butter, creamy and rich, and utterly unlike anything she had tasted in years. The cake itself was moist and perfect, each bite dissolving in her mouth like a promise that the world still contained good things, beautiful things, impossible things. Liesel ate the entire slice without pausing, without breathing, without thinking. She scraped her fork across the plate to capture every last crumb, every molecule of butter. Her stomach, shrunken from years of inadequate rations, began to protest. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, but she ignored it. When she looked up, she saw Corporal Bennett standing nearby with a large serving tray. "Anyone want seconds?" he asked with a smile that seemed genuine. Several hands shot up immediately. 20 minutes after the meal ended, Liesel found herself doubled over a toilet in the camp's latrine, her body violently rejecting the richness it had consumed. She was not alone. From the adjacent stalls came the sounds of other women suffering the same fate, their bodies unable to process the sudden abundance after years of deprivation. The pound cake, so beautiful and impossible just moments ago, now felt like a betrayal. Her stomach cramped with waves of nausea that left her shaking and weak. Frieda appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "I thought it was just me," she whispered, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor. "I ate too fast. I could not stop myself." Within the hour, more than half the German prisoners were sick. Some vomited, others suffered from painful stomach cramps and diarrhea that left them humiliated and weak. They had been in American captivity for less than 1 day, and already they felt reduced to something less than human. Liesel lay on her assigned bunk in the women's barracks, her arms wrapped around her aching middle. The shame was almost worse than the physical discomfort. She had lost control, had eaten like an animal, had made herself sick with greed and desperation. What must the Americans think of them now? That they were no better than starving dogs who gorged themselves until they were ill. Clara Zimmerman, the youngest among them, was crying softly in the bunk below. "I'm sorry," she kept whispering. "I'm so sorry. I should have stopped. I should have had more control." Sophie Brenner moved through the barracks with a damp cloth, tending to the sickest women with the practiced efficiency of her nursing background. But even she had been affected. Liesel had seen her emerge from the latrine earlier, wiping her mouth. With trembling hands, Lieutenant Ruth Coleman, one of the American female officers, entered the barracks carrying a wooden crate. Her expression showed concern rather than the disgust or mockery the German women had feared. "Ladies," she said through an interpreter, "please don't be embarrassed. This happens more often than you'd think. Your bodies need time to adjust." She distributed small glass bottles from the crate. "This is bicarbonate of soda mixed with water. It will help settle your stomachs, and tomorrow we'll start with smaller portions, gentler foods. We should have known better than to serve such rich fare right away." Greta Vogler, who had been too proud to show weakness until now, finally spoke. "Why?" she asked in halting English. "Why give us so much? Why not keep us hungry like good prisoners?" Lieutenant Coleman's face softened with something that looked like sadness. "Because that's not who we are," she said simply. "And we forget sometimes that kindness requires wisdom too." That night, as Liesl drifted into uneasy sleep, her stomach still tender and aching, she thought about the pound cake. How something so sweet could cause so much pain. How abundance could be its own form of suffering when your body had forgotten how to receive it. How even kindness could wound when it came too suddenly to those who had learned only deprivation. The following morning brought a different kind of meal. Captain Bradshaw had ordered the kitchen staff to prepare what she called transition rations. The women filed into the mess hall with hesitation, many still feeling the effects of yesterday's overindulgence. Their trays held plain oatmeal with a small spoonful of honey, dry toast, weak tea, and a single piece of fruit. Liesl stared at her apple as if it were precious jewels. Even this modest meal felt generous compared to what she had eaten in Germany over the past year. The captain walked among the tables as they ate, observing with the careful attention of someone who understood she had made a mistake. When she reached Liesl's table, she paused and spoke through her interpreter. "My brother was a prisoner in Germany for 6 months before he was liberated," she said quietly. "When he came home, we prepared a feast to celebrate. Roast beef, potatoes, pie, everything we'd saved rations for. He ate until he was sick, just like you did yesterday. It took us 3 weeks to teach his body how to eat again." The women looked up at her with new understanding. This was not some abstract military procedure. The captain had seen firsthand what starvation did to a person, how it changed them in ways that outlasted the hunger itself. "We will increase your portion slowly," Captain Bradshaw continued, "each week a little more. Your bodies need time to remember what abundance feels like. We failed you yesterday by giving too much too fast. That failure was ours, not yours." Frida whispered the translation to those whose English was weaker. Several women had tears in their eyes. They had expected punishment for their lack of control, perhaps reduced rations as discipline. Instead, they received compassion and a plan designed for their recovery. Over the following days, the pattern held. Breakfast remained simple: porridge, toast, tea. Lunch added soup and sandwiches. Dinner brought small portions of meat, vegetables, and potatoes. No butter-laden pound cake appeared on their trays, though Liesl found herself thinking about it constantly. The memory of that sweetness haunted her dreams. By the end of the first week, the women's stomachs had begun to adjust. The cramping subsided. They could eat a full meal without feeling sick afterward. Sophie Brenner remarked that she could already feel her body changing, some essential vitality returning that she had not realized she had lost. Corporal Bennett began explaining the meals as he served them, teaching English food vocabulary while the women practiced pronunciation. "Chicken," he would say slowly, pointing. "Bread, butter." The women would repeat after him, their accents thick, but their effort genuine. One evening, Clara approached Captain Bradshaw during inspection rounds. In careful English, she asked the question they had all been wondering. "The cake. Will we have it again?" The captain smiled. "Yes. When your bodies are ready, but next time you'll be able to enjoy it properly without suffering afterward. That's a promise." That night, Liesl wrote in a small notebook she had been given. "Today I learned that healing has a schedule. You cannot rush the body back to trust." 3 weeks into their captivity, Captain Bradshaw announced that volunteers were needed for kitchen duty. The work would be supervised, she explained, but it would allow the women to contribute to the camp's operations while learning valuable skills. Liesel's hand shot up immediately, as did Frida's and Greta's. They had grown restless with the monotony of camp life, the endless hours of sitting and waiting with nothing to occupy their minds. More importantly, Liesel found herself drawn to the mystery of American cooking, to understanding how these people created such abundance from ingredients that seemed almost magical in their availability. The camp kitchen was larger than Liesel had imagined, with industrial-sized stoves, enormous refrigerators that hummed with electric power, and pantries stocked with supplies that would have fed her entire Stuttgart neighborhood for months. Corporal Bennett greeted the volunteers with genuine enthusiasm, handing them clean aprons and introducing them to the other kitchen staff. The first lesson was bread. Not the dense, dark wartime bread Liesel knew, but the soft, white American loaves that had amazed her that first day. Bennett demonstrated the process with patient gestures and simple English. Flour, water, yeast, salt, sugar, he said, pointing to each ingredient. Knead like this. His hands worked the dough with practiced efficiency, pushing and folding until it became smooth and elastic. Liesel stepped forward to try, her hands sinking into the soft mass. The sensation was almost sensual, the way the dough yielded and resisted at the same time. Beside her, Frida laughed for the first time since their capture. "It feels alive," she said in German. Greta, whose English was strongest among them, attempted translation. "She says it is like living thing," Bennett grinned. "Exactly right. Yeast is alive. That's what makes it rise." Over the following days, the kitchen became Liesel's refuge. She learned to make biscuits, their flaky layers achieved through cold butter, cut into flour until it resembled coarse meal. She practiced pancakes, learning to wait for the bubbles to form on the surface before flipping. She discovered the science of gravy, how fat and flour created a roux that could transform simple pan drippings into something rich and satisfying. But it was baking that truly captured her imagination. The precision required, the way exact measurements and proper temperatures transformed basic ingredients into something entirely new. Bennett taught her about creaming butter and sugar, about folding in egg whites to create lift, about the importance of not overmixing cake batter. One afternoon, he pulled out a recipe card, worn soft from use. "My grandmother's pound cake," he said. "The same one you had that first night. Want to learn?" Liesel's hands trembled slightly as she took the card. The recipe was written in English cursive that she struggled to read, but Bennett talked her through each step. A pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of eggs, a pound of flour. "That's why it's called pound cake," he explained. "A pound of everything." She creamed the butter and sugar until it was light and fluffy. She added eggs one at a time, watching the mixture transform. She folded in flour with the gentle touch Bennett had taught her, careful not to deflate the air she had worked so hard to incorporate. When the cake emerged from the oven 45 minutes later, golden and perfect, and filling the kitchen with its sweet vanilla scent, Liesel felt something she had not experienced in years: pride. March 19th, 45. The Red Cross delivered the first batch of letters from Germany since the women's capture. Lieutenant Coleman distributed them during evening assembly, calling out names while the prisoners waited with expressions of desperate hope and barely concealed dread. Liesel received 2 thin envelopes, her mother's handwriting instantly recognizable, despite how the letters seemed to tremble across the page. She retreated to her bunk to read them alone, hands shaking as she carefully opened the first envelope. Her mother's words were cautious, written with the knowledge that military censors would read every line. But between the carefully neutral sentences, Liesel could read the truth her mother dared not state directly. The rations had been cut. Again, her younger sister Elsa had fainted twice at her factory job from hunger. Their neighbor, Frau Weber, had died, though the letter did not specify the cause. Liesel understood. Starvation was claiming the old and weak throughout Germany. The second letter was worse. It had been written in January, 2 months after the first. Her mother's handwriting had deteriorated, the words harder to read. "We are managing," she wrote. "Do not worry about us. We think of you constantly and pray for your safety." But then, in a moment of unguarded honesty, a single line. "Else asks every day if there is bread. I do not know what to tell her anymore." Liesel pressed the letter against her chest, tears streaming down her face. At that very moment, down in the camp kitchen, there were 50 loaves of fresh bread cooling on racks. In the pantry, sacks of flour were stacked 3 deep. In the refrigerator, butter sat in massive blocks, more butter than her entire neighborhood in Stuttgart would see in a year. The injustice of it crashed over her like a physical weight. Around the barracks, similar scenes played out. Frida had learned her father had died in an Allied bombing raid. Clara discovered her entire family had been evacuated from their home in Cologne, their current whereabouts unknown. Sophie read that the hospital where she had worked now treated patients who were dying as much from malnutrition as from their injuries. Greta sat silently staring at a letter that informed her both her sons, serving on the Eastern Front, were missing and presumed dead. That evening, Liesel could not eat dinner. She stared at her tray with its generous portions of pot roast, carrots, mashed potatoes, and a slice of chocolate cake. The food that had once seemed like salvation now felt like betrayal. How could she eat this while her mother and sister were starving? How could she grow stronger while they grew weaker? Corporal Bennett noticed her untouched tray. "Everything okay?" he asked with concern. Liesel looked up at him, this kind young man who had taught her to make bread, who had shown her nothing but compassion. "My family is hungry," she said in halting English. "I eat. They starve. How is this right?" Bennett's face fell. He had no answer. There was no answer. The arbitrary cruelty of war had placed her on the side of abundance, while those she loved suffered deprivation. That night, Liesel lay awake, wondering if surviving had been a blessing or a curse. November 22nd, 1945. Nearly 1 year since the German women had arrived at Camp Stonehaven. The war in Europe had ended 6 months earlier, but repatriation remained complicated by the chaos of occupied Germany. The women existed in a strange limbo, no longer quite prisoners, but not yet free to determine their own futures. Captain Bradshaw had announced that the German women would be included in the camp's Thanksgiving celebration, a decision that sparked debate among some American staff, but which she defended firmly. "They're human beings under our care," she had said, "and this holiday is about gratitude and second chances." The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves cut from colored construction paper. Long tables were pushed together to create a communal dining space. The kitchen staff had worked for 2 days preparing a feast that exceeded anything the German women had yet experienced. When Liesel entered the hall with the other prisoners, the sight stopped her in her tracks. The tables groaned under the weight of food, arranged in a display that seemed designed to demonstrate the impossible abundance of America. Whole roasted turkeys, their skin golden and crispy, sat on massive platters. Bowls of stuffing studded with herbs and vegetables, mashed potatoes whipped into snowy peaks, sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies, green bean casserole, fresh rolls with butter, and desserts. An entire table devoted to pies, apple, pumpkin, pecan, and cherry, their crusts perfectly browned and flaky. Corporal Bennett, wearing a clean dress uniform for the occasion, gestured for the women to sit. "Today," he announced, "we eat together, not as guards and prisoners, but as people sharing a meal of Thanksgiving." He had been practicing the German translation for days. "Heute essen wir zusammen." Captain Bradshaw stood to offer a blessing, her words translated by Greta, whose English had become nearly fluent. We give thanks for peace, for safety, and for the opportunity to show compassion even to those we once called enemies. May this meal remind us that we are all simply people trying to find our way home. The meal began quietly, almost solemnly, but as plates filled and the food began to disappear, the atmosphere shifted. The American soldiers shared stories about their own Thanksgiving traditions. Private Daniel Pierce described his grandmother's oyster stuffing, which his siblings always refused to eat. Lieutenant Coleman laughed about the year her mother had forgotten to remove the giblet bag from inside the turkey. The German women listened at first, then tentatively began to share their own holiday memories. Greta spoke of Christmas goose before the war. Frida described her mother's stollen, the special bread filled with dried fruit and marzipan. Liesel found herself sitting beside Corporal Bennett, their plates equally full. He had given her an extra-large slice of pumpkin pie, remembering it was her favorite. "Your family," he said carefully. "They would want you to eat, to be strong, to survive." She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She cut into the pie, the spiced filling, smooth and sweet. And for the first time since receiving her mother's letters, Liesel allowed herself to eat without guilt, to accept that survival was not betrayal. By early December of 1945, the physical transformation of the German women was undeniable. Liesel caught her reflection in the latrine mirror one morning and barely recognized herself. Her cheeks had filled out, no longer hollow and gaunt. Her hair, which had been brittle and dull from malnutrition, now shone with health. The uniform that had hung loose on her frame when she arrived now fit properly, even felt slightly snug across her hips. She ran her hands down her sides, feeling the reality of flesh where there had been only bone. The change should have felt like victory, like healing. Instead, it filled her with complicated shame she struggled to articulate. Around the barracks, the other women were experiencing similar disorientation. Frida had gained nearly 20 pounds, her face transformed from sharp angles to soft curves. Clara, who had been dangerously thin at 19, now looked like a healthy young woman. Even Greta, despite her grief over her sons, had regained the solid build of her former life as a schoolteacher. But with their physical recovery came a psychological crisis none of them had anticipated. Sophie was the first to voice what they were all feeling. "I look at myself," she said one evening as they prepared for bed, "and I see someone who has forgotten what her people are suffering. My body has betrayed my loyalty." The words resonated through the barracks like a confession they had all been afraid to make. They had grown comfortable with abundance. They no longer felt the constant gnawing hunger that had defined their existence for years. They slept on clean mattresses with warm blankets. They wore clothes that fit. They ate 3 meals a day plus snacks. Their bodies had learned to trust that food would come, that deprivation was over, and that trust felt like a moral failing. Liesel found herself deliberately skipping meals sometimes, trying to maintain connection with the hunger she imagined her mother and sister still felt. But her body, having remembered plenty, rebelled against this self-imposed deprivation. Her stomach would cramp and growl, demanding the nourishment it had learned to expect. Lieutenant Coleman noticed the shift in the women's behavior and brought her concerns to Captain Bradshaw. The captain called a special assembly, gathering all the German prisoners in the common room. "I understand," she began, Greta translating, "that some of you feel guilty for healing, that gaining weight feels like losing your identity, like abandoning your families." The women sat in silence, surprised that their private shame had been so visible. "But I want you to understand something," the captain continued. "Your suffering does not help your families. Your hunger does not feed your mothers and sisters. Making yourself sick does not make them well. The only way you can help them is to survive, to be strong enough to return home and rebuild when the time comes." Clara spoke up, her voice small. "But how do we deserve this when they have nothing?" Captain Bradshaw's expression softened. "You don't have to deserve it. You simply have to accept it. Grace is not earned, it is given. That night, Liesel ate her full dinner portion for the first time in weeks. The food tasted different now, not like betrayal, but like preparation for whatever future awaited her. April 3, 1946. More than 16 months after their arrival, the German women received official notification that repatriation procedures would begin within 6 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. The news should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it created a crisis that divided the women in ways their captivity never had. Liesel sat on her bunk that evening, reading her mother's most recent letter for the third time. The news from Germany remained grim. Food shortages continued. Her sister Elsa had been assigned to rubble-clearing crews, dangerous work that paid only in meager rations. Their apartment building had been requisitioned by occupation forces. They were living in 2 rooms with another family, sleeping in shifts because there were not enough beds. "Come home," her mother had written. "We need you." But the thought of returning filled Liesel with something she could barely admit to herself: dread. Not just fear of the physical hardship, though that was real enough, something deeper. She had changed in ways that made her unrecognizable to the person who had left Germany. She had learned English. She had learned to bake. She had discovered that she had value beyond her service to the Reich. She had made friendships with former enemies that felt more genuine than relationships she had left behind. Most troubling of all, she had grown accustomed to abundance. The thought of returning to constant hunger, to the desperate scramble for survival, felt unbearable. Was she a coward for feeling this way, a traitor to her family and country? Around the barracks, similar conversations unfolded in whispered German. Frida confessed she had been writing to an American soldier stationed at a nearby base. He had asked her to stay, had promised to help her navigate immigration procedures. Clara had received a job offer from a local factory owner whose wife had befriended her during church visits to the camp. Even practical Greta admitted she was considering requesting asylum rather than returning to a country where both her sons lay buried in unmarked graves. But others felt the pull of duty more strongly. Sophie insisted she needed to return to nursing to help heal the wounded nation. Several women spoke of elderly parents who depended on them, of siblings who needed their support. They viewed those who wished to stay as selfish, as choosing comfort over loyalty. The division created tension that had not existed even in the early days of their captivity. One evening, the debate erupted into open conflict. "You forget who you are," Sophie accused those who wished to stay. "You let them buy you with butter and cake." Liesel felt the words like a slap, but Greta responded with equal fire. "And you forget that we never chose this war. We were told lies, fed propaganda, made to serve evil we did not understand. Why should we return to the country that deceived us?" That night, Captain Bradshaw called Liesel to her office. "I need to know," she said gently. "What do you want to do?" Liesel looked at this woman who had shown her nothing but compassion. "I want to stay," she whispered. "God help me, I want to stay." 23 years later, 1969, Liesel Hartman Bennett stood in the kitchen of her Pennsylvania home, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she creamed butter and sugar for pound cake. Through the window, she could see her 2 children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Her husband Thomas, the former Corporal Bennett who had taught her to bake in that prison camp kitchen so long ago, was due home from his job at the high school where he taught history. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and possibility, exactly as it had that first day when she learned that sweetness could exist without suffering. On her counter sat a letter from Germany, her mother's handwriting now shaky with age but still recognizable. Els had married and had children of her own. The family had rebuilt their lives in Stuttgart, though the scars of war remained visible in both the architecture and the people. Her mother's letters came monthly now, filled with news of grandchildren Liesel had never met, of a Germany transformed almost beyond recognition. Liesel had returned to visit 3 times over the years. Each trip was complicated, filled with joy at reunion, mixed with the persistent awareness that she was now foreign in her homeland. Her mother never said it directly, but Liesel sensed the question beneath every conversation. Why did you stay? How could you choose them over us? The answer was too complex for words. She had not chosen America over Germany. She had chosen survival over despair, future over past, the possibility of becoming someone new over the weight of who she had been. Of the 47 women who had been imprisoned at Camp Stonehaven, 14 had chosen to stay. Some, like Liesel, had married American soldiers. Others had found work, built careers, created new identities in a country that had shown them unexpected grace. Greta taught German at a university. Clara owned a bakery that served both American and German pastries. Frida had become a translator for the State Department, using her unique perspective to bridge cultures. The 33 who returned had their own stories of courage and rebuilding. Sophie had reopened a clinic in Hamburg, treating patients with the same compassion she had learned to accept during her captivity. Others had married, raised families, and contributed to Germany's remarkable recovery. They exchanged letters with those who had stayed, maintaining connections forged in that strange limbo between enemy and friend. Liesel slid the pound cake into the oven and set the timer. In 90 minutes, her family would gather around the table for Sunday dinner, a tradition she had inherited from her American life, but infused with her own history. The cake would be perfect, golden and rich, topped with butter that melted into sweet pools. Her children would eat it without understanding what it represented, the transformation of enemy prisoners into family, of deprivation into abundance, of war into peace. But Liesel would remember. She would remember standing in that mess hall on December 9, 1944, staring at impossible plenty. She would remember eating until she was sick, her body unable to process kindness. She would remember the shame and the healing, the guilt and the grace. Most of all, she would remember learning that sometimes survival means accepting gifts you have not earned, nourishment you do not deserve, and the possibility that former enemies can become the people who teach you how to live again.